I'm going to open by, first of all, just inviting you all to just slow down and take a few deep breaths. And then I'm going to lead you through a passage that we talked about last week, having you repeat after me. And then we're going to do the same with a prayer, okay? So let's just take a few moments and quiet our hearts and remind ourselves why we are here today. Come to me. Say it after me. Come to me. You who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. We are here today to worship. We're here today to enjoy each other, to step aside from the busyness of life and just be a community together, and to be community for each other, especially for those whose burdens may seem a little too heavy right now. Now I wrote a prayer this morning, and I'm going to have you repeat this with me too, and then we will go right into the praise band. So join me in prayer. Father, some of us are tired. Some of us feel a crushing weight. All of us need rest. We come to you today because you are gentle. We come to you because you are humble. And we come because you love us. And Father, we come because we love each other. Together, we carry our burdens. And together, we lift our praise. Remember last week I was talking to you, and I was distracted during the message because my mic wasn't working, and I had sat on my glasses and destroyed them. So my mic is working, but it's going to take me a few weeks to get my glasses. So I have to kind of wear these down here, and I have the option of either seeing my notes or seeing you guys. So unless I perch them on the end of my nose, that's the only way I can do both. Hey, how did you do? Last week I gave you a checklist. So we are in the beginning of a series based on a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And if you would like to read that book with us, there's still a few copies on the desk out in the narthex, and we'd be happy to have you pick one up and do that. But there was a checklist of things that were associated with a life of hurry. I'll refer to it a little bit later. But it included things like being irritable or being restless, emotional numbness. We start to slip in our spiritual disciplines or just give them up altogether. And there are a whole list of things associated with hurry. And the main point we made in the message last week is that hurry is deadly to our spiritual life. It will just kill what's going on in us spiritually. And not only are our pastors and theologians interested in this, even psychologists recognize that people are just worn out and trying to do too much in too little time, and it is a part of our culture. So that's kind of what we talked about last week. The big idea for today's message is that Jesus came to save us from our hurry. The word salvation means healing, and I think that our understanding of salvation has been way too narrow, and many understand it to be primarily or maybe just going to heaven when we die. That's a very narrow understanding of the word salvation, and the word actually means healing. The English word for salvation comes from the word salve, a soothing or a healing ointment. Let me go back to a powerful sentence from last week's sermon. This is a quote from Dallas Willard, and this quotation really challenged me. I just want to read it again because it sets the standard for what our lives are supposed to be like. And salvation is rescuing us from anything that keeps our lives from not being like this. Here's the quotation. It is God's intention that our lives should be a seamless manifestation of the fruit of the Spirit, of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Salvation is an ointment to soothe and heal anything that gets in the way of that. And doesn't that sound like a wonderful experience? But it's often so far removed from what our experience in life is because we are too busy. Which leads to our next point. The place where this understanding of salvation intersects with the topic of life is hurry. Last week we made the point that hurry is an enemy to our spiritual growth. And the first point here today is salvation is being healed from a life of hurry right now. It's not something way off in the future. It's not something that we wait for until we die, but it's something that is available to us right now. Let me read a few statements that give us a different way of kind of thinking about what salvation is. Salvation is experiencing the recovery of our souls. Salvation is being reshaped in areas where life and our culture has warped us. Salvation is being healed in the deepest part of our being. And salvation is experiencing life that is abundant and rich. It's all of those things, and much, much more. According to Comer, the author of the book we've been reading, he said the solution to an overbusy life is to slow down and simplify our lives around what really matters. And there's a saying that I read one time, and I used to have this hanging by my door when I worked at a university, and it said, so I would see it every time I left my office, and it says, never let the things that matter the most be at the mercy of the things that matter least. And last week I told you that I'm trying to develop into my life the discipline of every day in the morning taking time to either write or at least say out loud, who I am today matters more than anything that I do. Who I am matters more than anything that I do. I had a what matters most moment at 2:30 this morning. I woke up with this nagging sense that something is wrong. Wasn't sure what it was, but something is wrong. And then I realized I had double booked myself for a time coming up this week. And I had for about a half an hour, I laid there in bed trying to figure out how can I make this work. And I juggled all sorts of possibilities. None of them were coming together. And then I realized I've really two options in front of me. Here was option one. Option one was pleasing a whole bunch of people who I don't really know all that well, and it would result in making me look kind of good. I mean, I'd be providing cinnamon rolls to a whole bunch of people, so who doesn't like that, you know? And so that was one option. I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna take a whole bunch of cinnamon rolls to this meeting, and it's supposed to be a tense meeting, and this will maybe calm people down, and it'll just be fun, nice thing to do. And I had committed myself to that. I had told several people, this is what I'm going to do. I'll do that. And they'd started to get excited about that. Then I thought about option two. Option two was being loyal to a friend in a way that no one will ever see. So I have a good friend coming to town today. His father passed away, and I had promised him that I would be available to help him move things out of his father's house. And it's going to be a huge, huge task. So I have these two options. I had to decide which one to do. And as I laid there in bed, I thought about the sermon I was going to give today in this question of what matters the most. And one way to think about it that has been helpful to me is to think, what will matter the most 5 years from now? So you face a conflict over your time or your priorities, a good question to ask, because oftentimes, if we're only looking at the moment, we'll make the wrong decision. So ask yourself, what will matter the most? Not right now, but 5 years from now, when I look back on this, which decision would be the best? So I decided to disappoint some people who I'd made a last-minute promise to, sent them a text at 2:30 in the morning, and to help my friend. And then I was talking about this with Susie this morning, and Susie said something, and I had to stop her and say, let me write that down. That was really good. And she said, if you commit more time than you have, you are always going to be stressed. Isn't that right? If you commit more time than you have, which I do over and over and over again, you are always going to be stressed. And yet that has become, I see wives nudging their husbands and going back and forth, even as I said that. But isn't that true? And so many of us, we make all kinds of commitments because they all sound good. And a lot of times they're all really good things. It's not like you're choosing between a bad thing and a good thing. There are 10 good things you can do, but you only have time to do 6 of them. And when we say yes to all of them, the only option is to just live at a high level of stress. So I thought Susie's words were right on. So how do we obtain this solving ointment that takes away the pain of hurry? How do we slow down and organize our lives around the things that really matter? And the next point is getting saved or healed is about becoming a follower or apprentice to Jesus. There used to be this really popular approach to evangelism. Some of you may have been trained in it. I was. And it involved going up to people you don't know at the mall or someplace like that and saying, hey, do you know that if you died tonight, you will go to heaven? I was actually loaded into a van once and taken to the Upper Valley Mall to go around and ask people that question. I didn't get a single convert, but I think I scared a number of people away from the Springfield Mall. But that was kind of the approach to evangelism, was to kind of start right there. And I think Jesus' approach is so much better. Jesus' evangelistic message was this: the kingdom of heaven has arrived. It's right here around you, waiting for you to enter it. Turn around and come into it. Just follow me. That was the evangelistic message of Jesus. The most common way that he talked about what we would maybe think of as becoming a Christian, or sometimes the language getting saved, was follow me. Follow me. In Mark chapter 1, it says, John was put in prison. Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. The time has come, he said. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Repent, believe the good news. Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will then send you out to fish for other people. And at once they left their nets and followed him. Matthew chapter 9, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. 20 years later, the Apostle Paul would write in 1 Corinthians 11, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Being saved, experiencing healing, focuses on what matters the most. Reorganizing our lives so that they are abundant and following Jesus. In the first century, there were rabbis, and rabbis had 2 things. Rabbis had, first of all, they had a yoke. And in the first century, we think we're not talking about eggs. If you come from an agricultural background, you might be thinking of the thing that ties like oxen together so they can pull. But in the first century, a yoke was a rabbi's set of teachings on how to honor the Talmud. So each rabbi had an understanding. Talmud was the book of law. Each rabbi had an understanding of how to live by the law in a way that results in a rich, good life. And that was the rabbi's yoke. All rabbis had them. Then the other thing that rabbis had were Talmudim. Talmudim were students who followed around the rabbi as an apprentice so that they could become rabbis. So all rabbis had these two things. They had an understanding of how to live a righteous life, and they had these Talmudim, groups of people who would follow them to learn like an apprentice learns. So this is learning not like a person who's going off to college. This is learning like a person who's going to be a plumber or a carpenter, and following someone around and working with them and watching every aspect of their lives to learn something. So all rabbis had those. So Jesus, I was going to have a trick question. What was Jesus' occupation? What was Jesus' occupation? Jesus has had two occupations. He was a Talmudim. There was a period in life where he was learning to be a rabbi during his 20s, and he probably did carpentry during that time. Actually, the term for carpenter in the Bible is actually broader than that. It's a builder, a person who builds something. So he probably did that to support himself while he was also spending time with rabbis, learning to be a rabbi. And then when he was in his 30s, he was a rabbi. How often do we think of Jesus as a rabbi? But that's what his disciples called him. That's what others referred to him as. But Jesus was a traveling rabbi. There were rabbis who were attached to specific locations and just stayed there and worked with one set of families. And there were rabbis who traveled around teaching. Jesus was one of those traveling around teaching types of rabbis. How many of you are familiar with the Great Commission? Little Bible quiz. Great Commission is found in Matthew 28 at the very end of the chapter. And it says, I'm going to change it just a little bit here. It says, then Jesus came to them. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go out and make Talmudim of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to do everything that I have commanded you to do. Talmudim is a word for disciples. A little bit of church trivia for Central. We come out of a background called the Restoration Movement, and they broke off from a couple of other denominations because they didn't like denominations, and then they became one. And then one of the very first things they started to fight about was, what are we going to call ourselves? Are we going to call ourselves Christians? And some thought that was a good idea. And then others thought, well, no, everyone says we're a Christian. We're going to call ourselves disciples. So that idea of thinking of ourselves as disciples is kind of a part of the tradition from which this church comes. So if you want healing in your life, if you want a life that is a seamless manifestation of the fruit of the Spirit, of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, you must become an apprentice of Jesus. You need to become an apprentice. Let's think a little bit about what an apprentice does. And again, my previous career was in higher education, so I'm kind of used to the classroom setting. Apprentices are very different than that. There are really three things at the heart of what an apprentice does. And the first thing is, if we're going to be an apprentice of Jesus, is just to be with Jesus. If we're going to be apprentices of Jesus, the first step is you just have to be with him. Like if you're going to learn plumbing or carpentry or any trade like that, you just have to be with someone who knows how to do that. So it starts like that. You can't become a disciple without spending time with Christ. We talked a little bit about ways of doing that last week. Really, the rest of this series is going to be about ways to do that. So that's where we're kind of going in this series. So spend time with Jesus. The next thing is to become like Jesus. So first of all, we want to spend time with him. The purpose of spending time with him is to become like him. And I love Eugene Peterson's version of that verse that we read last week from Matthew. Let me read this to you. Eugene Peterson wrote a book called The Message. If you've ever seen that, it's a kind of a modern reading of the Bible. Here's how Peterson wrote this. Are you tired, worn out, burnt out on religion? Get away with me and you will recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Watch with me. Work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay any heavy or ill-fitting thing on you. Keep company with me, and you will learn to live freely and lightly. Isn't that beautiful? So Talmudim don't stay Talmudim forever. Eventually, they become rabbis. So if you're going to be an apprentice, you have to be with the person you are apprenticing with. You want to become like them. And then the third step is doing what they would do if they were you. So if you've ever learned some new skill or something and the boss is away and you find yourself wondering, I wonder how that person would do this. If they were in my shoes, I wonder what they would do. And a big part of our lives as Christians is asking that question. If I'm supposed to be an apprentice of Jesus, so if Jesus faced the kind of day that I'm facing, what would Jesus do? If Jesus had to hang out with the people I have to hang out with, what would Jesus say? What would he do? But it is doing the things that Christ would do. And I want to read another couple quotations. This one's from Dallas Willard, kind of my spiritual hero. Willard wrote, "In this truth lies the secret of the easy yoke. The secret involves living as Jesus did in the entirety of his life, adapting his overall lifestyle. Our mistake is thinking that following Jesus consists of loving our enemies, going the extra mile, turning the other cheek, suffering patiently and hopefully, while living the rest of our lives just like everyone else does. That's a strategy that is bound to fail." Comer, the author of the book we're reading, said, "If you want to experience life to the full of Jesus, his nonstop conscious enjoyment of God's presence in the world, all you have to do is to adopt his theology and his ethics, but also his lifestyle." So what this book is all about, and there's another book the author wrote that we may come back to sometime, what the book is all about is practicing the way of Jesus, not just looking at his teachings, not just being grateful for his death on the cross, as important as that is, but also saying, how did he live his life in ways that I can mimic, in ways that I can model my life after Christ. What did Jesus do? How did Jesus live? I'm going to kind of go through this sort of quickly. But first of all, Jesus modeled a sustainable life. And that is a huge task. He had a huge task. His task was to save and change the world, but we never see him stressed, and we never see him in a hurry in the scriptures. Matter of fact, it's kind of funny. There's one point where his dearest friends, one is in big trouble and dying. It's Lazarus, and they say, "Come quickly," and Jesus seems to just sit down and sit there for 2 days and doesn't rush to Lazarus' side. It all becomes a part of the story later on. But you never find Jesus in a hurry. So what was Jesus' life like? Well, frequently he got up early. He often got up early and went out to a quiet place just to be with God. Now remember, we talked about this last week, if you feel guilty about not getting up early, I want you to remember, in the past, everyone went to bed when the sun went down. So people were well rested, but being well rested is a part of developing our spiritual disciplines. But Jesus frequently got up early and went off to a quiet place to pray. Jesus once in a while would go off for a few days or even a few weeks to get away from crowds of people. Jesus enjoyed long meals, good wine, and good conversations with friends. Jesus slept in. There are a couple times in the New Testament where his Talmudim, his disciples, had to wake him up. They were in the middle of a crisis, and Jesus was sound asleep. One time a boat was sinking. They had to wake him up. Once a week, he took a day and did nearly nothing. He took a break from his labor. And here's the most important one. This is one that wasn't listed in the book, but one that I had to add from myself. Jesus was willing to disappoint people. That's just huge. Jesus was willing to disappoint people. And there were many times, there were massive crowds of people, all of them wanting to be healed, but there were times Jesus would just say, I've got to get in a boat and get away. And he knew that even as God, living the life that he was living in a human body, he couldn't do everything. There were limits to what he could do that were a part of just being human. So Jesus modeled a sustainable lifestyle. The other thing he did is he created space for margin. And I love this idea of margin. Margin is the space between our load and our limits. So we all have limits to what we can accomplish. And our limits come from a number of things. Our limits have to do with our bodies. Our bodies limit what we were able to do. It has to do with our minds. Paul said we only know in part. We don't know everything. Limits have to do with our giftedness, ways that we're gifted. I sometimes watch other pastors and think, man, I wish I could preach like that. Or man, I wish I could do this or that. But I'm not gifted in the same way, so I can't do all those same things. We're limited sometimes by the season of life that we are in. I think often of young moms just because I'm around them a lot. But there are all kinds of things young moms would maybe like to do, but they're in a season of life that makes that extremely hard. So those are things that sometimes limit us. Time limits us. I was thinking about this, about what it would be like to do things if there were absolutely no limits on our time. Because that's what heaven will be. No limits on our time. So if you like gardening in heaven, gardening will be planting seeds in the ground where weeds never grow, and you have unlimited time to care for your garden. Taking an hour to spend working on your garden isn't taking an hour away from anything else. It's what the whole idea of eternity is. So I want to close by getting practical. Those are some suggestions. I hope you're taking advantage of the chance to read the book. But here are a couple of suggestions that are very practical. One is write out a rule of life. And a rule of life it's a concept that's been around for a long, long, long time. And a rule is like a trellis that everything else hangs on. That's what a rule of life is. It's like this structure that everything in your life can kind of hang on to it, and it pulls it all together. And one person described it as a set of practices or relational rhythms that help us create a space in our busy world for us to be with Jesus, become more like Jesus, and do what Jesus did, to live life to the full. Now, here's the thing. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail about this, but each person who attends here, if we have your email, you got an email this morning or yesterday. Suzanne Slagle puts these together, and there are a whole bunch of resources on how to develop a rule of life. Just a set of principles that you want to live by in order to focus on the things that matter most to you. So check your email. You can even check it right now if you want. And if that isn't in your email, just give me your name and your email, and we'll make sure and send it to you. We won't use that to bother you for lots of other things. But if that's not in your email today, let me know, and we will get it to you. It might be in your update file or something like that. But there are some really, really good resources in writing a rule of life. And it looks at the different parts of your life, and it's just a set of things you set out to do. And the other thing is to develop a fixed hour schedule that prioritizes your life around the things that matter most. So what happens after you write a rule of life, the second thing is you sit down and you imagine you imagine an ideal week that revolves around the things that are most important to you, and you schedule it. And you schedule the things that matter the most first. So often what we do is we do everything else, anything that's available to do, and then try to throw a little Jesus on top and hope that it works, and it just doesn't. I mean, I've tried that. We've all tried that. But this idea of developing a rule of life and a fixed hour schedule is actually scheduling our lives around the things that matter most to us, and the rest of our series is going to be looking at what some of those things are. So we can't accomplish this by taking a class or listening to a series of sermons. To achieve this, we have to become an apprentice. It takes time. It takes work. It takes grace. And it takes community. we help each other with. So let me say a word of prayer as the praise band begins to lead us toward the table together. Father, Lord, help us to number our days. Help us to realize that this life does not go on forever, but that a whole eternity awaits us. And help us to organize our lives around things that are deeply fulfilling, about things that give us joy and that give us peace and that advance your kingdom and that bless the people around us. Father, Christ came saying that he came for us to have abundant, overflowing life that exceeds our expectations. And I want that for each person who's here today. And I ask that your Holy Spirit would help us to take these ideas and principles to hand and to use them to draw ourselves closer to you and to become more like Christ our Savior.